Hi, Victor, POIs in the chat, please. I take one from closing later. Cool. Am I audible? Sorry, I should have asked that first.
Yep, you're audible.
Okay, cool. This is a regrets motion, which means that we are looking at this debate from a retrospective point of view. We're changing the way people view media, consume media, and most importantly, expect what they see in media. We say that it's a bit of a question of a chicken and the egg. We say that the racial narratives and harmful stigmatization against people came as a result of this. And as a result, the counter proposition we would propose would limit the worst and most nefarious versions of this from occurring. What is our counterfactual? We don't want to have a 24-hour news cycle whereas there's breaking news that happens at every hour of every minute of every day. We would rather have dedicated chunks of time. Usually this might be primetime television where there are sections on different areas that affect like daily news for like, let's say a city, right? Like a dedicated crime channel, like a portion, weather portion, like sporting events, stuff like that. We think that this is really like this the case as it has progressed, but we think that we would rather not have like, let's say, interruptions to transmissions with breaking news, and also just have a constant need to update and interrupt these channels. On that premise, I want to move on to the first substantive of our case, which is you increase the quality of news here. Here I'm to flag out three different things. Firstly, you always have to focus on everything at once with 24 hours news cycles, which means that you dismiss, you give the viewer less of an attention span to focus on each individual event. This is important because it means that major crises that occur oftentimes lag. That's to say, if a civil war happens in like Rwanda and there's like a tsunami that occurred like a week later, people oftentimes forget the type of things that happened in the past. Which happens is you kill off the long-term ability to assist these events or engage the populace in these events at the end of the day. But also, secondly, we think that you're constantly rushed to have new material. And this is important in specifically to dealing with the quality of the news because a couple of things happen if you are under vast amounts of time pressure. Firstly, you cut massive amounts of corners when it comes to editing types of things. If you have a time crunch to have to upload this, and which happens more frequently with a 24-hour news cycle. Secondly, you choose more biased sources that feed into a broader narrative that you think is going to be appealing to the masses. Thirdly, and this is important, you choose the low-hanging fruit that you think people are going to like necessarily want to see, but not rather something that they would want to spend time on. And this is important because you kill off and you trade off long-form content on their side of the house and you replace it with vast amounts of short-term content, which means that people are broadly aware of certain issues, but they aren't aware and are able and to consent and be able to consent into certain issues that are more proximate to men and things like that. Thirdly, we think that the consumer does not feel like they're able to keep in track of certain subjects and certain topics. And the thing is with news, the way that they display it is they try to make the consumer feel as if they are the expert of things. But the thing is, if things are too broad, you're having less like productive conversations because the interpretations of these events are far shallower as a result of that. And I want to emphasize this part importantly because I think that like Anna said this emotion because like she's a journalism major and she's kind of afraid of what like maybe the career market looks like and what it actually looks like. But we think that the specific actor that creates the worsened quality of these news is our journalists, right? And we want to characterize the type of journalists that are affected. Firstly, we think that these are younger, inexperienced journalists who just came out of journalism school. These are the ones who oftentimes have to stay up long nights. You have to work the midnight shift. You have to drive towards these different areas for like a car crash or a burglary or whatnot. These are the people who oftentimes feel pressure to do so in a toxic way. But secondly, combined with the fact that in many of these industries, there's the narrative of being the last one in, first one out, and the fact that you're easily replaceable because of a shallower CV, you're far more likely to do things like cut the corners, as I mentioned above. Thirdly, because of the lack of labor protections when it comes to stuff like that, you are also pressured to engage in sensationalization into these narratives. The impact of this is quite simple. 24 hours news cycles creates political narratives and social harms. Like, for instance, choosing biased victims that say, it was because they're Black, the reason why they committed this type of crime. Because the fact that this community is certain but more aggressive. The fact that it is 24 hours makes it so that it is constantly there to have a race to the bomb because you want to compete with the other agencies to have a more sensationalized news. But the thing is, you also want to create more narratives because like burglaries every single day is not going to create more people on. So you want to create more radical radical forms of this, more radical narratives that becomes a race to the bottom in the future. The comparative is, and I know opening op might say, but this is going to be symmetric. There are a couple reasons why this is not symmetric. Firstly, we think media companies are likely to call each other out now. In the status quo, they can't do this because it's like blaming someone for something that you do yourself, because other media companies are also engaged in this. So you can't say, you're cutting corners when they're also cutting corners, choosing biased victims, etc., biased witnesses, etc. Secondly, this is a retrospective debate. So we argue that in a world in which people are socialized into not seeing this breaking news at every single moment of their lives, they're less willing to, they're going to have less overall negativity bias, i.e. it's pretty rare for someone living in a rich neighborhood to be robbed. But what 24 hours news media says is that you think that you are going to be the one who gets robbed. So this negativity bias anchors in these individuals when there's a 24-hour media cycle, which makes them more likely to support things like broken window policing, tough on crime, things like that. The third thing is 24-hour news cycles preys on people's confirmation bias. So they see these articles and say, this confirms the expectation I've had of them before, and this is like the exception that proves the rule and whatnot, and whatnot. So you selectively choose these news cycles to fit your certain arguments. Before I continue on, closing opposition, your extension, please.
Well, journalism isn't exactly quantitative finance. The barriers to enter it are pretty low, and consequently, there's a surplus of people who want to be journalists at any one time. You get treated like shit when you enter these organizations, regardless, and often could produce poor quality by virtue of the same logic.
But what we're trying to say is that because of the exact same things you mentioned, you're likely to cut corners. You're likely to choose witnesses that are not the strongest witnesses because they confirm your overall narrative. You're not likely to spend more time researching because you can't differentiate against the crowd, etc. Our positive case is simple. Firstly, you have higher competition based off of the quality of the reporting. That's to say, you have younger journalists now given more time spent on each different report that they have to make. More time means that they're more likely to be able to do things like talk to witnesses that might be difficult to apprehensive at first, but after more persuasion do want to talk to you. Secondly, there's more coordination because now schedules are aligned, because the rich editors who are 80 years old don't want to burn the midnight oil, but now they're working during the same times and things like that. Thirdly, you increase more checks and balances on each different part of this production chain, i.e. you increase checks and balances on the witnesses that come in, the paper you produce, editorial stuff like that, because you're not under a time crunch. At the end of the day, this is a retrospective debate. We change the way people are socialized into news. That's the most important thing OG will give you.
I thank the speaker with fine speech and I invite the leader of opposition. You're here.
Right, can everyone hear me? POIs in the chat, please.
You're audible.
Fantastic. All right. Then with that, I will begin. Jean Baudrillard is right. We live in the age of the hyper-real, where people have access to nearly infinite information at all times. Given this, we would rather this information be disseminated by institutional news media than independent reporters, which is the actual counterfactual that open government had to engage with. A couple of pieces of framing. Firstly, a lack of real-time updates and reporting by institutional news media is the comparative we're willing to defend here per OG's analysis, things like designated spots where otherwise institutional news media outlets can't report outside of primetime TV. Importantly, social media still exists and people are still likely to check their Twitter feeds. Don't let OG run this cop-out of people are socialized not to want the news. We'll explain why people are still going to broadly check their Twitter feeds, people are still going to check social media, people are still going to want some capacity of information, even if they don't want news coverage specifically, they're still going to want some amount of information about the world. We live in the hyper-information age. The question is, who would we rather be the disseminators of that knowledge? Is it institutions or is it individuals? And it is institutions every single time. Secondly, generally speaking, real-time updates to pressing news are good because people probably deeply care about these things, and it's probably good that people deeply care about these things. As a result of globalization and the hyper-information economy, people will become more interested in national and international affairs with shorter attention spans in light of moral convergence and globalization. People care about what happens in Ukraine. People care about what happens in Israel-Palestine. Why is this probably a good thing? Because people care. It's a fact that people's moral circles have expanded. A fact that people now care about conflicts on the other side of the world. The fact that people care about news stories on the other side of the continent or on the other side of the planet. The fact that a tide soccer team that has the attention of the entire world as they are trapped in a cave. The fact of the matter is that the 24-hour news cycle uniquely reflects the expansion in people's moral circles and interests towards people who they otherwise might not have considered worthy of their time, attention, and respect. Why is this the likely counterfactual? And importantly, why are people checking their social media feeds likely to be even worse? Number one, I think people still care to some extent on both sides of the house. There's still going to be access to this information. Number two, the barrier to entry to social media is so low and social media is so ubiquitous, they're probably going to be able to do this very easily. And number three, social media is just really, really fucking addictive. It's very, very easy to get into the loop of scrolling Twitter, scrolling TikTok. You're still going to be exposed to information at a constant pace, even if you're not checking the news directly, even if it's not BBC articles, it's going to be some independent thing. Finally, why do people not look at social media already? And why is this like uniquely comparatively bad on OG's side? I think the difference is that on our side of the house, people's Twitter feeds are covered with BBC articles and updates. On their side of the house, they're going to see a guy who says, NASA confirms aliens real, shocking revelation, right? I think this is the comparative that they have to deal with, the comparison of individual people who have misaligned interests, people like conspiracy theorists, people are going to disseminate information in a much, much worse way. So what then is our main argument? Just basically, why are news outlets good and why is institutional news a good thing? Firstly, you have a much higher level of quality control. You have journalists, experts, economists, etc. So even when you're giving hasty analysis, you have the ability to do real work. The comparison here is that accuracy is far higher, expertise is far higher. The counterfactual is either A, individual people who are able to disseminate knowledge with very, very low checks and balances on power, or B, nobody just cares about the fucking news anymore. Like, let's take OG's comparison at their highest ground and assume that the news has just become this enlightened arbiter of perfect knowledge and information. Like, nobody's going to check that when there's some guy who's posting 5 minutes, every single 5 minutes explaining how, like, there's some new fucking, drone that Russia has deployed in Ukraine or whatever that's going to like blow up the entire world, right? Like, people obviously have these interests and have the desire to see sensation. It is good that we then take them where they are at and try to do the best job that we can of being arbiters of objective information in those standards. Secondly, you have the ability to check back against the records of institutions and hold them to a certain standard. The CNN and BBC have a reputation to uphold. They can't fuck up too much or people lose faith in them. News outlets obviously aren't infallible, but they can also be held legally accountable for their content in ways that individuals in many cases aren't. This is because news outlets often receive things like public funding or public grants. They have a certain journalistic obligation to both be objective in their content, not be too politically biased. Like, for instance, both the BBC as well as Canadian broadcasting companies have legal obligations not to be too legally biased in their reporting towards one particular side of the political aisle. But secondly, they obviously want to ensure a high amount of public trust to ensure that instead of just having a maximal click-through rate, they actually have accountability in news, they actually have accountability in journalism. The final thing I want to note here is that there's a competitive incentive to fact-check competing news organizations that exists probably higher on our side of the house. Because it's not just about beating someone to the punch, it's also about beating someone to the punch better. If you have a reputation as a news outlet that's consistently able to deliver consistently high-quality coverage and analysis of pressing and breaking news, you are likely to get more viewers on that subject than people who have low-quality analysis of pressing and breaking news. I think the incentives for this are very intuitive. Thus, there's a competitive incentive to not just be the first mover, but be the first best mover. And insofar as that is the case, there's a competitive incentive to do fact-checking in as good a way as possible to try to ensure these stories are disseminated in a good way. I'll take CG.
My weird uncle is already brain-pilled on QAnon and aliens. I am unsure what the fuck is your comparative.
No. Come on. This is absolutely not true, right? Like, if the comparative is that you can only watch news at designated times, it's going to be way more people than just your aunt that believes in QAnon and aliens. It's going to be a lot more fucking people because it's way more interesting, right? It's way more interesting to hear about how there's a cabal of pedophiles running a pizza shop that like controls the world on social media than it is to watch, some fucking 60-year-old news anchor be like, and on today's news, the sports team scored a goal or whatever, right? Like, obviously, you have to meet people where they're at. You have to sensationalize to some extent in order to get to any amount of buy-in into the news cycle in the first place. We would rather that amount of sensationalization and buy-in happen at a point where you have some amount of control, some amount of institutional leverage over what people see, and some amount of a reputation that you have to respect on either side of the house. The unique difference on their side is when it's institutional, it's not institutional, it's isolated actors, there's no accountability, no enforcement mechanism, and no checks and balances on power. That is the unique comparative they have to do. Finally, I think there's a capacity and ethics issue they have to bear, right? I think individual reporters on their side of the house are not going to have to abide by the standards that of ethical conduct that a reporter working for a news organization is going to have to. Because if the reporter acts unethically, they're going to get fucking fired, right? They're going to lose their job. Whereas an individual, a freelancer, basically has zero ethical standards so long as they can bring in clicks, so long as they can bring in attention. The important comparative then is, insofar as there are more isolated actors on their side of the house, more individual people on social media, we're going to get far less ethical coverage of news stories. What does this look like? Things like invasions of privacy, things like we're covering stories in an even more egregious manner than OG talks about, using things like even more inflammatory language, baiting people's sensitivities around things like race, gender, sexuality, etc., to an even greater extent, because you have zero ethical issues around your conduct. On every single issue, in terms of the actual comparative in this debate, OO is.
I thank the speaker for the fine speech, and I invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
Hello everyone, hope you can hear me. My POI preference would be that you put it on your camera wave or use like the Zoom wave function. I think that's nicest. If you can't do that, like unmuting and saying it as well. Sometimes a bit disruptive, but yeah, I just don't see the chat, so I wouldn't be able to include on that. So I hope that's okay. Okay, pull up the timer. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The fun thing about regrets motion is that they are regretting. They're counterfactual worlds that would have existed where the world is fundamentally different. The problem is the analysis in OO runs on what is likely to be the comparative is predicated on a world where the standards of 24-hour news cycle already exists. But notably, at the point where it never does exist to begin with, the expectation we talk about, where you want new news, everything has to be more sensational, everything has to be fun, doesn't exist to begin with, because that's not the comparative we have. I think Victor preempts this really smartly when he tells you the way we perceive information is what we expect from it, which is based on the socialization we have. At the point where we had the 24-hour news cycle, we expected everything to be more radical, everything to be more extreme. Because the reason I watch like CNBC, I don't know, choose one YouTube channel to one news channel to the other one is because that sounded more interesting. It was more expansive. And because it's a 24 cycle, I'm always in this competitive cycle of having to be the most interesting one. So people click on my link, so people watch my thing. I think crucially at that point, this expectation of news has to be fun and thus sensationalized is even came to begin with, which is the prerequisite to access OO claims. In the absence of this, I just don't think this happens. I hope Deputy ratifies and actually runs a decent case of what this debate is supposed to be about. But I think even if not, I think the crucial expectation OO talks about, so let's take them at their best and say this is the counterfactual, of actually having access to like good quality media, i.e. I prefer someone with a BBC link over like a person who just texts something, still is possible. Because no, not every news media does 24-hour cycles, but there's still going to be news media specialized on things, right? There's still going to be something in Germany, there's still going to be local news media, there's still going to be different ones. I.e., all the news that you could talk about is still being talked about. The difference is do 100 people talk about it or do 10 people talk about it? I think at that point, you still are able to like send proof. And all the mechanisms all gives you on why people choose BBC over the other ones in the status quo, which is the prerequisite for their comparative working, still apply. And to the same extent, I don't think this actually exists. I think Victor's analysis of forgetting and quality control, which I'll expand upon in a second, still work. I still think this happens. Media is just not that good when they tell about, legal obligation and then send to fact check. I just think people just don't have the time. Competing news organizations oftentimes don't really understand as per Victor's analysis. I just don't think they have the capacity to do so. And oftentimes these media organizations are not dumb, but they do this in a very like gray area way where you're probably not able to be legally liable because they just make innuendos, suggestions, use provocative titles, have boring articles. I think at that point your accountability mechanisms don't really work. At the point where the pressures they are under are the same as the QAnon conspiracies. But the second thing is like, but you have competition between news media organizations. I think this doesn't work because in your world, you have like 100 different news being dropped like every week or something. The problem is I don't have the capacity at that point read multiple news articles on the same topic because there's just so much I have to actually cover. To the extent I even do this, I'm much more likely to just read one article, i.e. the comparative mechanism just doesn't apply because they're not actually comparing anything. Freelancers are much more likely to exist on your side at the point where these news organizations have to pump out so many articles to fill 24 hours. At that point, they're unable to actually like hire their own workers to do quality control, but rather hire freelancers to much larger extent. And these freelancers, again, don't have legal accountability as per OO analysis, i.e. all the problems OO talks about happen to much larger extent on their side when freelancers are needed to a bigger extent. But let's really run through the two claims you make in Gulf. Firstly, quality decreases and people are harmed. Let's firstly talk about quality decreases. There's three mechanisms on how we get there. The first thing is limited funds, right? We just tell you these organizations oftentimes are really underfunded. Characterization, news is free online, people don't pay for it, i.e. the amount of revenue source, no one has subscription, sources is limited. This is bad because one, the amount of money you can spend on journalism is a lot lower, i.e. everywhere in the production process, you have pressures to just reduce costs and bring out more articles because the way you measure your success is if you can fill the 24 hours rather than get people's click, which is more likely means you just press them and push them out as fast as possible. The second thing is you're likely to play on the same narratives that pre-exist. Note Victor explains why these disproportionately tend to be racialized narratives that are minority groups, because that's what people buy into easily, i.e. you get more clicks on that. I think on a comparative, the way you differentiate news articles is not based on clicks, but not based on sensationalism. But because you only have limited amount of news to actually interpret, you're more likely to read all of it. At that point, you make differentiation based on quality, which is why people actually care about quality, and because they just don't only read headlines, but the actual articles, because analysis on why they care about getting informed. But secondly, note that at the point where you're so bombarded with information, it is impossible to read everything. At that point, differentiation mechanisms of how people choose what to read is purely based on what triggers my emotions to largest extent. News media organize it and sensationalize it to larger extents. That means they more play into these narratives which divide people and polarize them. But thirdly, note that because you always have new media, people forget about stuff. They forget about humanitarian crises because one crisis happened, but then 20 other news media happens and forget what happened 20 times ago. But also politicians are more able to get away with bullshit they do just because no one remembers it because 20 other things happen. Comparatively on our side, we have different incentives because you're one, less likely to have new news which crowds are actually important news. But secondly, people are okay with having the same news repeat over time because there's not expectation that constantly news gets out. But notice also clashes their analysis of but media and organizations are better. No, because the New York Times can get away as well with having bad journalism because people forget that to the same extent that this mechanism applies. On our side, you differentiate yourself through quality because people actually read. Secondly, you prioritize self-selection, right? Because you only publish 10 articles instead of 100. You probably choose the best 10 articles, i.e. we get better quality. But thirdly, we remember this to a large extent, but media actually gets useful. Second claim we push on OG, it's the idea to get people interpreting. There's three different ideas belong this. Firstly, psychological pressure, right? I think at the point where you just have tons of news 24/7 bombarding you, you're just unable to constantly keep up. And I think this is really hard for over mechanization where people care about being informed. At that point, I feel I'm insufficient. I'm not a good citizen. And I feel bad about myself. Scale is large because it's an everyday thing that happens for scale, but also because the reporting is more sensationalized. I'm more likely to be afraid about the world. I'm more likely to feel like I'm living in an unsafe world. Again, the scale here is that every single day for the rest of my life, I think scale is massive. Second claim, dissociation with political social issues. I think the bar to engage goes up massively, right? Because at the point now where I have to engage I have to read so many more news, I just likely to opt out of it because I feel like this is impossible for me to ever get into. At that point, I'm more likely to not get into it at all because I know I can't be a good citizen anyway. I might as well give up on this totally. I think this means that I'm likely to make worse decisions when I vote and engage politically. I'm likely to be less political and less likely to hold people political or corporations to account. But thirdly, I'm more likely to buy into simple narratives like populism, which differentially scapegoats minorities because those are the only ones giving me easy answers to my world. But the third claim under this is that journalism becomes hierarchical. Because it's 24/7 news, you're forced to make news more specific. I.e., I can't just run big stories, but rather I have to news stories, which oftentimes means I go more into the detail and become very specific. So this is bad because it means news has higher barriers to entry, right? Because I have acquired previous knowledge to actually access this news. This means it's less accessible to people. And people who want to get into news to begin with are unlikely to do so to the same extent just because their barriers are higher. I opt out to being informed in general. This is bad because principal obligation to be a good democracy and as a good citizen, I need to have information. It means I make worse solutions and I'm more likely opt into easy solutions, easy narratives. I fucked up here, guys. I'm very sorry, Theo.
I thank the Speaker for fine speech, and I invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Awesome. I'm just gonna set up my timer really quickly. All right, start my speech in three. Oh, actually, sorry. Yeah, POA is in the chat, please. I'll probably ask for one for closing at some point. Okay, Start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Two very simple things in my speech. Firstly, independent reasons as why 24 hours news are done quite well by institutional news outlets at the moment in the status quo, and why it's likely actually going to be better that this culture makes them do 24 hours news. Second, actually comparing what the counterfactual is, why is the counterfactual probably significantly worse, because a lot of things that OG actually says applies more to individual and like smaller like reporters and journalists, and if anything, it's probably worse on their side of the house. Yeah. Firstly, let's explain why 24 hours news like outlets are currently done well, and what is the like culture like what does this culture do, right? I think prior to the rise of this culture, these big news outlets were probably reporting at certain times, but they were not trying to report at all of these like a 24-hour window and constantly report on things. I think this does a couple of things. One, in response to what OG says, these big companies like BBC and CNN probably will start fucking up, will start producing less less good quality news because they can't handle us. I want to note that BBC and CNN hired thousands and thousands of people and are global like corporations across the world. This means that they probably can handle the workload. I mean, I don't know. If you know that your company is expanding, you're expanding from an 8-hour news reporting window to a 24-hour news reporting window. The most intuitive thing is to not decrease the quality of your product, but probably to hire more people and I don't know, create departments that do that. So it's probably not true that they can't fact check, that they can't edit their stuff just because they now have to report in a longer scale. It's probably true that they'll just hire more people, enforce more specific departments, do this well. Secondly, if anything, I think they do it better on our side of the house, right? Because there's actually more like a repeated action of reporting. It means that they create a bigger fact-checking department. It means that they invest more money into this type of stuff that actually improves their infrastructure. Secondly, they say that this forces them to do more specific reporting, and that's really bad. I'm actually not sure why this is the case. I think that more in-depth reporting can actually be really, really good for people. The reason why is because you actually get more perspective on news stories. For example, you're more able to fit in things like interviews. You care more about these things because you can actually look for these things in the first place. But secondly, in a world where you don't have a lot of time, obviously the type of stories that you're going to choose are stories that, are big headlines, things like war, things like what's happening in the world, things like politics. On our side of the house, you actually get more stories about smaller things, about the average guy, about the local news that's actually happening. All of these things are really, really good information to have because it informs you better about your surroundings. It allows you to have better access to information. Opening government says, oh, but people have limited time span. They can't process multiple information. I think that's quite an absurd assertion. We live in a world where all of us are college students. A lot of people read the news. A lot of people see things around their world. A lot of people have phones. They have a lot of access to a lot of information. I've never seen anyone go oh my God, I can't process information just because there's a lot. Most people probably can process it. Most people know how to pick and choose. Most people can just read stuff and then understand it. Maybe put it down in the notes app if you can't remember it. I don't know why people can't process this information. Thirdly, it is probably good that these news media outlets will do it well. This is because they're probably competing with social media in the status quo as well. They want to ensure that they're more fact-checked. They want to say that you should probably watch the BBC Reels instead of the Instagram Reels because our Reels are more informative, probably more accurate because it's produced by a more reputable source. So obviously, these large institutional news outlets have incentive to compete with social media as well. They're going to do this well. Lastly, it is probably not the case that they'll do more things like use racial comments or be more biased. This is because the government regulations that actively apply onto a lot of these large news media outlets apply significantly more in the status quo because governments have incentive to obviously regulate these media. They're probably going to do it in a good way. We know this is true. I don't even need to prove this. This is just factually true. Governments regulate media and they don't allow them to do things use hateful narratives and shit like that. If anything, different news media outlets also check each other. That's not important. I'll take a point from closing if they have one.
What can I do to fix climate change?
What can you do to do? Sorry, what? Could you repeat that?
What can I do as a person to fix climate change?
I mean, there are a couple of things you can do as an individual. I'm not sure why this question is important, but there are things you can vote in a better way. There are things I can learn about this issue and do individual things maybe, for example, consume less meat or support policies that are more environmentally friendly. All of these things are things you can do. And even if that's not a thing that you can do, access to better information is still a good thing because people are more educated. This means that they'll make more meaningful choices, even if they're small. Okay, why is it comparative worse? I think the comparative is worse because opening government never actually engaged with what the counterfactual is. People have a desire for information. So the absence of a 24 hours news cycle isn't a world where people just automatically go to sleep at 9 p.m. and never check the news again until 7 in the morning and open their TV. They probably care a lot about like what's happening around them. They probably do want to know what's going on in the world. This is because they're also constantly told by their friends that we live in a global world, that you have access to your phone, that you have access to other stuff. You should probably care about what's going on in other places in the world. What this does as a result is that you're probably going to go on your phone and you're going to follow individual journalists that are doing reporting for 24 hours anyways. You're going to go on Twitter. You're going to go on TikTok. You're going to go on all of these social media outlets where people do report about these things. Government cannot say that TikTok and Instagram and other stuff otherwise wouldn't exist if a trend of 24 hours news doesn't exist. Obviously, those obviously still exist, and there'll still be people doing this type of stuff because they want to create that information. In a world where this market is extremely saturated, people will race to report these things anyways. This counterfactual means that the comparative that government needs to defend isn't a world where people are only looking at news at certain times, where they're still looking at news at different times, checking their phones when it's 12, when it's 3 a.m. in the morning. But what they do instead of looking at actual BBC, CNN, other reputable sources on TV that actually tells them about what happens in their local department, they look at and they follow the random guy on IG that probably is way less good at producing quality information, that actually is fact-checked, that actually is able, like less susceptible to things like conspiracy theory. The reason why this information is likely to be better when it's produced by institutional outlets that rises as a result of this culture is, one, because they're probably more legally checked by regulations. Two, they have more internal quality check because they have a reputation to uphold. But three, when it comes to reporting conduct, they know to handle things like privacy. They know how to handle things like sensitive reporting and sensitive information. All of these things, the average guy on Instagram that's just like pulling out their Apple phones to record on the street probably don't have access to, and probably would do a really bad thing of. If anything, those narratives are likely to be far more biased, far less professional. But lastly, even if this is not the case, we think that the existence of more news media outlets having to compete with social media is a good thing in and of itself. It might force individual reporters to be better, to be less biased, to have more quality, to be better fact-checked. All this gives more resources and more choices to people that allows them to get better, accurate facts.
I thank the speaker for fine speech. I invite the member of government to open the case for closing government.
Hi, am I able to? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, great. Each and every moment you scroll through TikTok per OO, it is a moment of depression. It is a moment where you see another tsunami, where you see the climate change becoming worse, where you see the political environment getting worse and worse, and you know that you cannot do anything about it. We think that doom scrolling, and specifically the negative associations and things that create weight, are a necessary event that happens because of the 24-hour news cycle. We're going to mechanistically prove why that is the case. But before that, some rebuttal to OO. Two main things, and I think George will give them. One, they never prove why information necessarily matters. Like, for all of we care, they say that you become more educated. I do not think that is a self-evidential good thing. I might become more educated about, I don't know, wild alt-right fast ideology by OO, and that is not necessarily a good information to have. They need to provide why information necessarily itself is good. If we prove to you that even if you have information, it doesn't really matter, we still beat OO. But secondly, notice that all of their comparative is literally the status quo. Maybe OO is a very good debate team and they constantly case file, but when people scroll through TikTok and Instagram, they don't scroll through BBC, CNN, etc. They scroll through Hassan Piker. They scroll through Ben Shapiro. I am uncertain why it is necessarily reputable media under OO that is directly doing this. What does OG do? OG says many things, but fails to prove most of them. They say that there is misinformation. This is because of a variety of news sources and news cycle, etc. They say that people become desensitized to media. This is, and the only mechanism they have is because of the massive increase of news, not on the incentives and how these news are created or how people interact with them. And lastly, they say that people lose interest and disengage by donating to tsunamis, etc. We think that these are not the most important things that are specifically related to the news cycle. What are we going to prove specifically from CG? One, specifically prove the counterfactual, what is the likely thing that's going to happen. Secondly, prove framing why information doesn't actually matter and why the amount of information is too much. And then lastly, why we minimize doom scrolling, specifically why there is pressure to engage the news, why this news is necessarily depressive, which OG did not prove. Lastly, why people internalize this message and therefore feel worse about themselves and their current situation. Okay, what is the counterfactual? OO is trying to counter out of this debate. We think the counterfactual is this. Yes, people have a necessity to get more information and more stuff. I'm uncertain why this information is news. I think that the factual is two things. One, people still scroll social media, but they're more likely to scroll through memes. They're more likely to scroll through family posts, more likely to scroll through gossip and news that is not part of the news cycle. But secondly, I think conspiracy is symmetric. The reason for this is because echo chambers exist under both sides of the house. People that are susceptible to conspiracy theories are people who are least likely to have critical thinking. Therefore, they're still going to go through the echo chamber. It is uncertain kind of extreme what OO is pushing. This means that yes, people still track for information, but not particularly news information. It's just fun. Framing. Why most information you get from the news is not actually important. I think 3 reasons. One, you have minimal capacity to enact change. OO can say you can become vegan and limit climate change, but we all know that as a person, that is not enough to change anything because most problems are actually systematic. Secondly, your vote is unlikely to be affected by new information that comes out. Only the critical information that is likely to come to the boss of the house. This is because most voters have already predetermined ideology that is likely to be voted based on the way they were raised, based on the parents' affiliation and vote, etc. Therefore, it is unlikely that one event is the thing that is going to change your vote, or even the amount of news is likely going to change your vote because you already have a predisposed information on that. But thirdly, they do not increase accountability to the system. This is because the amount of information that is out there is too much for you to pick one thing that is wrong. It is easy for Trump to say, I am bad, but Biden is also Trump, because the amount of information you have about the Hunter Biden case is too fucking much. Therefore, all of this information neither increases capacity, neither increases accountability. Notice, all teams in this debate, both OG and OO, are reliant on proving why information matters. So long as we wash this out and say it doesn't matter, all can prove as much as they want that they get more information and better, but it doesn't matter in the debate. Case. We minimize the amount of doom scrolling because of the shift in social media. Why there is pressure to engage in the news cycle, particularly because there is a 24-hour news cycle. I think 3 reasons. One, there is direct peer pressure. This is people in your job talking about the new news that just hit 30 minutes ago, 1 hour ago, and therefore you want to be part of the conversation and you want to engage with them. Secondly, I think there is a particular fear of missing out personally, that you think that things are going out there and you're not part of them. By engaging the news, you at least feel like you're part of that thing, I guess. But thirdly, notice that from a young age, specifically in democratic countries, we've been propagandized to engage with the news or to be more active and aware citizens. The point that this is not the case, but also secondly, this means that you're more likely to engage with the news the more that the news are out there, therefore the more they're pumped. Therefore, the 24-hour cycle specifically links to this because it is a constant filtering of this propaganda, a constant filtering of this peer pressure that you need to engage. Why the news is necessarily depressive in the way it's portrayed? I think 2 reasons. One, specifically because of the 24-hour news cycle, there is a need for you to re-engage with the news. This means that they need to provide shock, but they also need to provide fear. This is because you want to be kept up to date, to see how many people might have died from the tsunami, to see what the fuck is going on, because as a person, you're more prone to fear and stuff that makes you afraid, not to re-engage. But secondly, they want to rile you up. This basically in order for like populist demands, but also because in order to, again, be kept up. I'll take a walk.
I mean, you might think being educated is not a good idea, but it seems like the average individual thinks being more educated and knowing how to vote is a good idea. So on a comparative, they will...
The burden for OO is not to prove being educated is good. Being educated to the extent that they provide is good, which they never proven. They need to prove why the education or the is not enough. Okay. Why people internalize the message and therefore feel worse about themselves? I think, one, they are necessarily portraying things as a systematic problem. This specifically linked to the amount of news that comes out there. Because of so many news existing, it is easy to portray things that you have no ability to change, even if you might do, I don't know. Most times you don't. This means that you feel too small or small enough to not change anything. But secondly, notice that there is a reverse narrative in most societies that due to capitalism and hyper-individualism, that you can't change things, that you're able enough to do things in order to affect change, like recycling, etc. The moment you notice that you're too small and that you cannot change them specifically because of the amount of news out there, is the moment where depression starts to kick in. But thirdly, notice that it is a repeating cycle that is constant. You scroll and scroll and scroll again. This becomes part of your daily life. Guys, Generation Z is enough depressed. We don't think we need to. We think that this is specifically because of the 24-hour news cycle. Vote CG.
Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep.
Great. Give me 1 second. I need to put some water. Okay. And my speech. 3, 2, 1. Housekeeping, to clarify to the panel what is symmetric and what is not symmetric in debate. Okay. 1. In both sides of the house, journalists have an incentive to break stories and to find the top-notch scandals. If CEO wants to prove the delta of you're overwatching what is happening, therefore you're going to report more to top-notch stories and more scandals, they're not comparative, right? Because you can still look overnight and find the capacity to be able to report on them. Please close your camera. I don't approve this. Okay. Secondly, I think the moment that you don't report like 7 to 9, that's not the moment that you don't have the capacity to gather information for this stuff. Like Watergate scandal that happened before the social media platforms, journalists had the capacity to gather information. The tipping point and what is fundamentally changing is the following, because CEO says that they are the only one characterizing pressure. The moment that you don't have to report on the spot is the moment that you take a breather and you go deep when it comes to having accurate information on how you report. So this is where we flip CEO. We explain the following on the counterfactual. In our side of the house, because you're not allowed to report after 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening or whatever, you take time through the night to investigate and to find ways to be able to create a narrative, to have more effectiveness when it comes to how you shape the story, how you deliver the story, how much accurate information you have. On the moment of peer pressure and competition inside opposition side, you are rushing through the data, you are rushing through how you're crafting the narrative. First benefit we have on closing government, we explain how information can be better off the moment that journalists have the capacity to take a breather and actually be more accurate on the words they choose, the data they choose, and how much of a deep they go to the story to be able to cover it. Second of all, I think in order to be able to have like CEO characterization and pressure being effective, they have to explain why in our side of the house, journalists won't have an incentive to be able to investigate this kind of top-notch stories, why they won't have the incentive to have more money coming into this kind of businesses, because people do care about information per OO and CEO framing. Let's now watch what OO says about the counterfactual. And this is how we're going to differentiate also from opening government. OO has a contingency to prove and push on us that the counterfactual is individual-based, right? That they say that journalists on their own are going to report and individuals are going to report. Therefore, this is the most plausible counterfactual always pushing. If we disprove this counterfactual, we differentiate from opening government that is contingent on having a counterfactual because they have negative arguments without a plausible counterfactual opening government, then opening up has a key contingency to overbury their case on this counterfactual. Why the individual case is not likely to happen opening up? 4 responses. People don't have the resources and the connections to report on different stories. They have only the proximity of their phone or what's happening around. Secondly, we contest with opening up and we say people don't care to report enough for the stories because they have other stuff that is more proximate to them, like poverty, making ends meet, be able to solve relationships, being fatigued by your job and different other existential crises you have. This means that the amount of reporting individuals do is limited significantly. Thirdly, Panagis explains why your feed is bombarded by other stuff as well. So this means that, any type of individual investigative journalism is being cancelled out by all the other things that you're engaging and you're reporting. All of this means that there is a huge likelihood in the house that people don't engage with this kind of individual investigative journalism. Fourth reason is because, media in Answer the House doesn't have to be boring per LO, but you can have also fucking amazing journalists that make stuff really interesting, like John Oliver or whatever, that has the capacity to craft this in a much better sense. 5, I think there is a kind of brand loyalty and a gravitas. It is more likely that I will engage to someone that I know that has a degree on it, that someone that has some type of transparency and accountability for his actions, that is signing the article versus my Uncle Tom, or like a irrelevant person that is just writing stuff on Facebook. All of this analysis, all these 5 reasons include that the characterization and the incentive and the capacity of an individual in us at the house, on our counterfactual, is more likely to engage on investigative journalism from official authorities and official platforms rather than just any individual you see on the social media. All of this means that all the harms that opening up is pushing on us are completely crafted over, exactly because they don't have a counterfactual that they contest further. The only thing that is left then in opening up is more resources that is good. And this is where we say, even if you have more money, if this money is not better allocated, that does not have a net benefit. So all the class about information, A, is not entirely proven on the comparative why you have better information if you don't prove the capacity to have these check and balances that they claim. Secondly, the money is not going to the right place because all of the journalists are forced and coerced to be clickbaited. They're forced to be first, as they say. This means they do slack when it comes to the quality of investigative journalism that they do. They do then to be extreme. Per Panagis characterization about the dramatization of media outlets and stuff like that. Thirdly, what is the extension of closing government to opening government? We take the burden to prove desensitization to the full and maximum extent. And CEO says, oh, people are generally depressed. Sure, some people are depressed for general reasons. Some people are depressed because they have existential crisis from the over-bombardment of negativity that is being included and polluted by this kind of model they have in Answer the House. Even if in Answer the House you have 10% of the historic population being less depressed, it's a fucking massive burden. How do we prove that people are disengaging in Answer the House better than opening government? A, we explain and we take the burden to characterize why there is a negativity and dramatization that is leaning and becoming exponentially more extreme than the House because of the clickbaiting that reward as per closing opposition characterization, because journalists are not feeling safe when it comes to the higher competition and more individuals popping up and doing investigative journalism. All of this proves that I'm sorry, I missed time. All of this proves that the competition and the peer pressure that journalists have, leading them to over worry about their jobs, leading them to make more shock factors titles, that is leading to more dramatization. And all of this is kind of like, piling up to your mind, subconsciously speaking. The moment that your phone is keep on bombarding about fires, about, deaths, about decapitations and wars, is the moment that you're disengaging from reality and you're feeling that you cannot do something about it. You're feeling that the negative news and the negativity of how humanity plays out is too big of a failure and you cannot do something. All of this creates, mental pressure to you and to what extent you're trying to activize, to try to collectivize. Why this on comparative is better? Because you have time to breathe. You don't have to read every time. You trust the journalist to prioritize the most important stories and to deliver them in the best way possible. This means that you have the capacity to pick and choose what you're engaging on. You have the capacity to not be bombarded without you consenting to your phone that you keep on watching this kind of social media stories and stuff like that. This means that you see the top 5 and 10 stories and you pick and choose which one you're engaging, which is significantly better because, you have time to breathe and you're not overwhelmed by this kind of negative stories. For all of the above reasons, because depression matters to the spectrum closing government.